All right, we're continuing our studies on leadership. This is lesson number 13, 17 in all. So we're quickly getting toward the end of our studies. We'll wind these up at the end of December. Tonight we're focusing on communication. Remind you each time of what our goal and our purpose is for our series of studies, trying to develop future leaders, both in the near future and distant future. Also preparing families for what their husbands, particularly wives, what their husbands may be and go through as a leader, as she is in that supporting role, and then what the rest of us could then benefit by gaining what leadership is all about, help us to better understand. And again, we're going to, at the first of the year, which is not far off, a little over a month, we'll be asking, don't know the timing of that exactly, but the elders will be asking for your input, those who may near meeting the qualifications within the next 1 to 3 or 3 to 5 years, and we'll give you more details about that. So that's part of what this series is all about. Now, what lies ahead for us, next time we're going to be dealing with the qualifications of elders for 2 studies, or at least a study and a half, and then we'll take the second part of that second study and we'll deal with the question of why there are not more elders. Why is it that you go to churches that are maybe this size and larger, and there may be only two men qualified, or maybe in some places no men qualified to serve? Why are there not more elders in churches? It's sad, and so we'll try to answer that question in that study next 2 weeks from tonight. So let's talk about communication just a little bit and how important that may be. I want to begin with a few quotes that I think get to the heart of what communication is about. Gaskin said that communication to a relationship is like oxygen is to life. Without it, it dies. And I would say amen. Of these 3 that I'm going to mention, this is my favorite of the quotations. And Nat Turner said, good communication is the bridge between confusion and clarity. That's true in leading a nation, and that's true in leading a home, and leading a business, and leading in any church or anywhere else. Good leadership and good communication is the difference between confusion and clarity. Zig Ziglar said, in many ways, effective communication begins with mutual respect, communication that inspires and encourages others to do their best. And I think that indeed is true. We're going to see that principle as we go a little further. Communication is a vital part of leadership. I think we all agree with that. That goes without saying. And if you want to be a leader, and I hope that there are several in our study tonight that are looking toward the future and say, you know what, I want to be one of the leaders of the future. If you want to be a leader, that is, you want to influence others, you need to be able to communicate and to communicate effectively. So let's begin by talking about what's involved in communication. Let's get a picture of what communication is, and then we're going to build on that as we go a little bit further. Communication is the transmission of information. You say, well, that's pretty simple, and it is. But when we're talking about communication, this comes from this Latin, our English word communication comes from a Latin word communicare, which means to share or to make common. And so you think about the idea of what you have in your mind, your thought, if you share it with others and you make it common rather than keeping it to yourself, you are communicating. Now, communication involves imparting information from one mind to another. And so it may be your thoughts, it may be your feelings, it may be some instruction you want to give, it's some correction you want to give, but you communicate that from your mind to some other mind and it's received, there is communication. Now it has to be received on the other end. Would you agree? And that's why 1 Corinthians 14 talks about in speaking in tongues. You don't just speak in tongues unless there be an interpreter, because it has to be received. The message has to be received on the other end. All right, with that in mind, let's go a little bit further. I want us to see that it's a two-way process. And the 2 ways that I want to talk about is not always true in some areas. Now, some of you may disagree, but my concept, I've never been in the military, but my concept of the military is the commanders give orders and they send it down the chain, and there is not really so important to get feedback. You just do what you're told. You just give the chain of command. Well, that is communication, because there is the command, we want you to do X, Y, Z. We command you to do it, and you do it, and you don't give any feedback. Well, that's not true in other areas. It may work in the military, but that doesn't work in the church too well. So we'll look at these two concepts. That communication involves giving information that has to be received. And so we're talking about leaders giving information to the congregation. It has to be given, and it has to be received. Then that's not the same as agreement. This means it has to be received for it to be communication. But I'm more interested for a moment in this other side of the coin, and that is there needs to be a listening, especially true when leadership is involved in church matters, that there has to be communication of information going out from the leaders, but there has to be some information coming back to the leaders, some input, and they need to know what's going on among those that they're leading. Make sense? So that's why I say it's a two-way process, and we're going to get to that here before we get out of this point here in just a moment, a little more detail. I want to see how this applies to elders or leaders. Now, why do I separate elders and leaders? There's some of you sitting here thinking, I would like one day to maybe be in the role of being an elder in the church, and that's great. But it may be that you'll find yourself sometime in a church. Maybe you have to start a church, and there's not a plurality of men to be qualified. You may not be at that point of being qualified yet. Or it may be that there's just not, for some reason, there's not elders in that church, but there are going to be some people who are going to be in leadership position. I don't mean they've appointed you as the leader or one of two leaders, but there's going to be people of influence who can influence and lead others. If you've ever been in a church without elders, there's always a few that are more leaders than others, and that may be you. So with that principle in mind, there will be information and thoughts that need to be transmitted to the congregation. How well is that done? That's another question we'll answer before we get through. Secondly, there may be information and thoughts that need to be transmitted to some individual. Sometimes leaders or elders have information that needs to be transmitted to this person, but it doesn't need to be disseminated to the whole group. It doesn't apply to the whole group. We'll make that distinction as we go along. And furthermore, the leaders must listen to questions. They must listen to input, suggestions, and concerns and problems, because there will be suggestions, questions, concerns, and problems down the line, and they need to be on the listening end, absorbing what's being said. Make sense so far? All right. Now, what we've just described is this picture. And I want to start with the conclusion, then come back how we got to that conclusion. And the conclusion is, when this happens, you have communication. And that is, you picture walking into a congregation and you get to know this congregation, and you get the impression, you're new here, that the elders are giving information to the congregation on a regular basis, and the congregation is receiving that information, meaning they're understanding it. Doesn't mean they always agree. Furthermore, they don't push back unless it's a matter of principle that they think we can't conscientiously go along with that. But they go along with wherever the elders lead because they think that's the best judgment. But on the other hand, you see the congregation is giving information back to the elders, and they tell you the elders are listening to us. They take our suggestions, they mull them over. They don't follow everything we say, but they take some of that and they mull it over and they give us feedback then. Are you impressed with this church so far? I'm impressed with that because that's the way it ought to be. Would you agree? That it ought to be that the elders are giving information being received, the congregation is giving the elders information, and it's being received, and now we have communication. Make sense? All right, that's what we're about tonight. So let's talk about how communication is essential to elders. So let's get our Bibles, and we're going to trace some passages now that you say, well, where does the Bible say elders need to communicate? Well, we don't have a passage that says that I, Paul, write to you, Timothy, instruct the elders to communicate to the congregation. You don't have those words, but we do have those principles. Let's look at several passages, and you can help me with reading some of these. These passages tell us that elders need to be communicators. And so, just picture for a moment you're a young man sitting here saying, I want to be an elder one day, but I'll just tell you, I'm not a communicator, and I'm really not interested in communicating. You might want to rethink whether you want to be a leader. You might want to rethink that, because to be a leader, you need to be a communicator. You need to be a communicator. Here's why. Let's start with 1 Timothy 3, 4, and 5. Paul talked about the qualifications of the elders, and what does he say here in verses 4 and 5?
One who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God?
All right, very good. Notice the comparison is, if he rules his house well, he can rule in the church of God well. And if he can't take care of his household, how can he take care of the church? So the principle is, he's to take care of the church like a family. Well, he has to communicate with his family, does he not? And so that's the point I'm trying to get you to see. It's a biblical principle that says he must be a communicator. All right, 1 Timothy 5:16 says, those that we ought to honor elders, and then there's in this passage, the double honor should be given to those who they serve well. Yeah, they rule well, they serve well. Well, if he serves well or rules well, what does that mean? He's got to communicate. He's got to communicate. All right? So Hebrews 13:17 says his job is to watch for their souls. That's the main job of elders, is watching for souls. They have to meet, make decisions. They may make decisions about the property, about money, but their main job is watching for souls. Well, if you're watching for souls, there has to be some communication. You may need to feed that soul. You may need to teach that soul. You may need to correct that soul. You may try to guide them back. That takes communication. All right, 1 Timothy 3:2, one of the qualifications is he is to be apt to teach. Yes. He's to be apt to teach. If he's to be apt to teach, that means he has the ability, and so he can communicate. Now, that same phrase is used with reference to men becoming preachers. They are to be apt to teach. Suppose a man says, I want to preach, but I'm just not much at communication. I'm just not good at getting my words and my thoughts all in the right words and getting it across. What are you going to tell him? Find another job. Get you another job. Because you've got to communicate to preach. Same thing to be an elder, you need to communicate. Making sense? All right. Here's another. I'm just trying to compound some evidence showing elders need to be communicators. They need to be able, this is, by the way, Titus's parallel phrase to being apt to teach. This tells the degree to which he needs to be able to teach. That he might be able to do what? Titus 1:9? Rebuke the gainsayer. So there's going to be false teachers arise up, and he may need to be the one to answer that. It falls on his shoulders. As one of the elders, the eldership has the responsibility to see that that is taken care of. 1 Timothy 5:17 talks about those that rule well, that we read earlier. Point 2, are worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in word and in doctrine. And so if he's going to labor in word and doctrine, how can he do that unless he communicates? All right. So none of those can be done without communication. That's the point. Make sense? All right. Let's go a little bit further now. Elders are not to lord over the flock. Let's turn to 1 Peter chapter 5 and in verse 3. 1 Peter 5 and verse 3. They're not to be lords over those entrusted to you. You mentioned the elders. That they're called elders in verse 1. They shepherd the flock, verse 2. Nor as being lords over those entrusted to you. He's got the English Standard on that. It doesn't say lord over. It says domineering. Yeah, they're not to be domineering over. Vincent says that carries the idea of a high-handed rule. I like Vincent's quite often, he's a lexicographer, by the way. He quite often captures the thought in a couple of words. High-handed rule. I like that. I don't like high-handed rule. I like the description there. That he's describing here, this domineering, lording it over the flock. Barnes says their dominion is not to be that of temporal lordship. It is to be that of love and of truth. In other words, elders don't rule with an iron fist. Here's what I get from this verse. That means elders need to lead rather than drive. Would you agree with that? In other words, in the military, you can drive and say, this is what you're going to do, and I mean you do it, or you're in trouble, and go do it. And they better do it. How well does that work in the church? It's not. It's not going to work at all in the church. And so you don't lead with an iron fist. You don't drive people. You lead them to do the fact that I don't know of any Bible principle where elders are described as driving someone. They're taught about leading people. The principle of leading, like a shepherd would lead his sheep. Make sense? What does that have to do with communication? Why do I mention that here? All right, yeah. Good point. Good point. What else? Absolutely. Shuts down that feedback. You're not going to get any feedback when we're going to drive you. This is the way it's going to be. No talk back, no lip. This is the direction we're going. Well, you're going to lose most of the church. They're not going to put up with that. Any other comments? Good point. Yeah, you can't lead from behind. You're driving from behind. Good point. You lead from out front. Absolutely. Good point. All right. It's imperative that elders impress upon the members that they want to communicate. Is that important? Why? I put here they demonstrated in a number of ways. How could they demonstrate that? How can an eldership demonstrate we want to communicate? A two-way street. Say again. All right, always ready to listen. Very good. Ask for feedback. Good. Say again. Be approachable. Meeting with the men. All right, there's a number of ways. We'll get to some of those that you just mentioned, and we'll come to more. Let's talk about what needs to be communicated. We're going to spend more time right here than we are on the other points, these next 2 points. Let's talk about what needs to be communicated. Elders need to communicate several things. And here's the first. They need to communicate the Word of God because they are given the responsibility to feed the flock, are they not? That doesn't mean they're doing all the teaching. I'm starting with the second point, responsible to feed. They must also be apt to teach. It's the elder's responsibility. Let's suppose you have a preacher that gets lopsided in his preaching, and he's preaching stuff all one-sided. Maybe it's all real simple, first principle, and never has anything on the home and the family or on evidences. Who's to blame for that if that goes on for year after year after year? The elders. Because it falls back on their shoulders that they are to feed the flock. If the flock's not being fed, they may have to deal with the preacher, but it's not just the preacher's fault, it's the elders. They bear responsibility. Would you agree? And so they need to communicate, whether they're seeing that that's done or they're doing it themselves, they need to communicate the Word of God. That's pretty simple. They need to communicate love and concern. Would you agree with that? That needs to be communicated. They need to be caring people. They are responsible. Acts 20, in verse 28, says they're to feed. Some translations will use the word tend the flock, as a shepherd tends for his flock. He's caring for his flock. He didn't just throw feed out and didn't care about them, but he's tending after his flock. And so the elders are shepherds in that same sense. See, when members get this message, they're more apt to come with those questions and those problems and those suggestions that they may have. Here's something else. They need to inform the church of what's going on. And we're going to say more about this in a moment. This is a common complaint. I don't mean this is a common complaint here. I'm saying it's a common complaint among churches where the complaint is the elders are giving too little information. I've mentioned this before and I'm going to mention it again just to lay the groundwork. I've been places in meetings where I go and maybe there's 150 people there this time, and I go back a few years later and they're down to 85 or 100, and I say, what happened? Where'd everybody go? And I get the impression from talking to some of the members and some of the elders that the complaint was the elders, whether it was true or not, were not giving enough information. They weren't communicating. We were kept in the dark, and so a number of people left. That's happened a number of places where I've been. So I'm saying that's a very common complaint. So one of the things the elders need to do is that of disseminate some information of what's going on. In other words, make people aware of the plans, the decisions, changes. Give explanations of why decisions were made. Does that make sense? Why is that important? We decided to do X, Y, Z. Just accept it. We may jump to conclusions. Why is it important to explain some why? Yes, ma'am.
An explanation shows that there was thought put into it, there was consideration. It wasn't just off of why or just opinion-based or preference. There were people and things.
Yeah, there was a reason behind that. There were several things to consider, etc. Yeah, it may be that we think the elders just made a quick decision, but they may have taken a long time deciding and have had to weigh out several different factors to make that decision. And that makes people go along with it much better. A steady flow of information is going to keep down distrust. Would you agree with that statement? I borrowed that from someone else who was writing on leadership recently. A steady flow of information that people feel like we're being told what's going on. We're being told where the money is going. Our questions are answered when we ask. Will keep down distrust. Here's something else elders need to communicate. They need to communicate warnings and admonition because elders are spiritual watchmen. Let's look at Acts 20 and verse 32. Paul told the elders of the church at Ephesus what? Well, wait a minute. I've got the wrong verse for you. Tell me what. That's not the verse I wanted. Verse 30. Or any of those verses right in there. Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. And I also meant to include verse 31. Therefore watch. Here's what I'm after. Because these men will arise, speaking perverse things, you need, as elders and as leaders, you need to watch. Elders are watchmen. That's the point we're after. They watch for souls. So that means they need to disseminate some information warning about the dangers that are potential, not have already occurred. Potential dangers. Would you agree with that? What's the value of that preventative measures, as I mentioned here? It is. Sometimes the damage is too late when the damage is done. So if there's some error circulating among brethren, and we think it could infiltrate the church, warning about that, is that a preventative measure? Oh yeah, you bet. You bet. You see some weakness developing in some homes and families, so maybe some teaching on the homes and families may strengthen some. Is that a preventative measure? Sure it is. Elders need to disseminate information, give warnings and admonition. Maybe talk to individuals that are drifting. So you're already beginning to see elders' communication is not just an announcement that's made to the church. It may be talking to an individual about their problem or going to somebody about their need. And so there's a number of ways in which they communicate. Furthermore, communication involves seeking input from the congregation. This is the big complaint a lot of places have concerning their elders. Leaders need to encourage people to come to them with questions and comments and suggestions, ask for input. And I want to get to this last point on the screen, and that is, that's not surrendering leadership. Why would I need to make that point? Or do I need to make that point? Yeah. All right. I've heard it said that I've seen extremes where the extreme I'm concerned about, I've heard this worded this way, that elders need to make the decisions. They don't need input, and if they get any input from anybody, that shows they're not leaders themselves. I don't buy that. A man can be the leader of his household and yet consult his wife about what her opinion is on that matter, what her judgment may be. It may differ from his. He could even change his mind and still maintain his leadership. He hasn't given up his headship at all when he changes his mind because of her input. And when elders change their mind because of the input of the congregation, they haven't lost their leadership. They haven't surrendered their leadership. And what I'm trying to suggest here is you're looking toward the future. If you're a young man saying, I want to be a leader someday, don't ever think that you're surrendering your leadership if you get input from someone else. Does that make sense? So communication involves soliciting that input, asking for questions, comments, suggestions, and listening to that input. Any comments on that before we go further?
You expect the leader to not take input, you're assuming that they have all knowledge of every subject to make decisions from, and you're wanting them to do it to criteria.
Yeah.
They would have to rule without any input from it.
Any input at all. Good point. Yeah. And we don't want that at all in leadership. Elders need to communicate with each other. They need to keep each other informed. I've known of a few cases, very seldom, but I've run into a few cases over the years where it seemed like this elder knows more information, but he doesn't share with the other elders, and so then that kind of gets things lopsided in the eldership. And so elders need to share things with one another, that information that they have and what they know. More than just meeting and making decisions, they need to share their thoughts and ideas and visions, and that makes for a better working relationship. In other words, more than just, here's what my idea is on this point we're trying to decide tonight, but the more the elders get to know each other and kind of know their thinking process, how they reason things out, how they will react to something, then you better understand what's going to happen when you come to a meeting together. Does that make sense? I think every other elder here will agree with that principle. That once you get to know each other, the more you get to know each other, you can predict the outcome of this meeting, and you can know where things are going to go in this meeting, how things are going to go when you go see somebody, and how they're going to react, etc. Make sense? All right. Now let's shift gears now and talk about ways to communicate. We're still talking about this is essential to the eldership to communicate. And so we've just got through talking about what needs to be communicated, ways to communicate, ways that elders, leaders communicate. One is obviously by public announcement. And so we do that from time to time. There are matters that pertain to the whole group. There's some matters that may seem small, a small concern to leaders. I found this to be true, since they know what's going on, but an update may be a big deal for the church. Let me explain what I mean by that. Let's just pretend we're about to build a building, a new building, and the start date was the contractor says he's going to build our new building. He's going to start, and we've announced to the congregation he's going to start December 1st. First Monday in December, he's going to start digging footers. And we get information that we got a little trouble with our permit, and it's going to be delayed for about 6 weeks. So we don't announce that to the congregation. And so Monday comes and no work done. The next Monday comes, no work. And here January 1st, no work comes. People are wondering what's going on. And so are we seeing a problem developing with the church? Not a big problem. But the elders think, well, it's just a little delay in the permit. We just had a little problem and there's really nothing to announce. That may be a bigger deal to the church just to know, here's why we're delayed. Here's what's going on. You're being informed. Since we know what's going on, it doesn't seem like a big deal. Does that make sense what I'm saying? But that little deal might be a bigger deal that you're being informed. You're being kept in the loop. You know what's going on. We're not holding anything back. Make sense? All right. Now, I've seen that from time to time, and you perhaps have dealt with that perhaps in other places. Public announcement is one way. Another way that communication takes place is by personal contact. These are matters that doesn't concern the whole group, but it may be something you need to go to that person about. And I'll give a couple of things here. One, much of what any one elder will do is going to be by personal contact. You pick out any one elder and say, where does he do most of his teaching? With the exception of a man who preaches all the time, that might be an exception. Where does that elder do most of his teaching, most of his encouraging, most of his correction? And it's going to be probably not in public, it's probably going to be in personal contact, isn't it? That's where he does most of that work. And furthermore, you might want to go talk directly to a person or a couple that's raised a question rather than make an announcement about it. Here's somebody raised a question about a class, or maybe raised a question about a meeting we have, a gospel meeting we have, or maybe a decision the elders made. Rather than getting up and announcing about that, it might be better just take that information to that couple. Does that make sense? Judgment comes to play in that regard. Questions or comments? All right, here's another way in which communication may take place. Discussion sessions. Jared mentioned this a moment ago. The elders might meet with the men of the congregation and ask for input. We do that twice a year. We might meet with all the deacons from time to time, or you might meet with each one individually because his work may be somewhat different from this guy's work. What are your concerns? What problems do you have? What can we do to improve your work? What help do you need, et cetera, et cetera. And so you may meet with that one deacon and then meet with another deacon. We've done that from time to time. Might need to meet with all the teachers. Might need to meet with one particular teacher because of a problem in her class or whatever the case may be. Making sense? Now let's talk about how communication breaks down. How does communication break down? We're talking about with reference to churches and elders and leaders. Sometimes because little effort is made to do that. Would you agree with that? That's what we were talking about a little bit earlier, where I've been several places that I've mentioned where maybe several people left because they felt like the elders are not communicating with them. Sometimes elders think that leaders make decisions without input and they just tell the church. That's the attitude we dealt with just a moment ago. We make decisions, we're in authority, we don't need input, we'll just make those decisions. Communication is breaking down. There may be some input that the church could have given. I put the word seem in quotations here, leaders who seem to be holding back information. What would that mean? Yes. There is information the elders will have that needs to be held back. You may be dealing with a couple that has marriage problems and you're dealing with all of that and there's sin in their life that needs to be dealt with and it's not public. And so, yeah, there are confidential things elders deal with. But let's broaden that out and eliminate that and think about things that are not confidential. Yeah.
They're not giving us an update. It hadn't started. It's been 4 weeks now, and they said it'll start Monday.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It just seems like we're kind of not kept in the loop of what's going on. Here, the elders expect us to help fund that by our contribution, and yet we're not in the loop. Larry?
We could be assuming, assumption practice. A lot of times the leaders we assume everybody knows, and therefore we're holding back information. We have assumption that it's wrong.
Good point. Everybody understands, everybody knows, and they may not. All right. Sometimes thinking, here's another way communication breaks down, thinking that announcements are the only way to communicate, so we leave little or no time for give and take. What I mean by that is there is still room for some give and take. By give and take, I'm talking about where you can have a conversation with someone and they ask questions and you can respond and there's a little more communication going on. Where taking some information to an individual or to a couple that has asked for that might give a little more give and take than a public announcement. That's what we're after there. Here's something that I think is very important in communication. Incorrect words are carelessly chosen words and then assume everybody's going to figure it out. And that's where we're careless in our wording. Communication involves using the proper words. We're doing a class on Sunday afternoon for sermon prep, and one of the things we're talking about this coming Sunday is using the right words. You got to choose the right words because words are vehicles of thought. You choose the wrong word and you sent the wrong message. You communicated the wrong message. Or carelessly chosen words. and we just assume everybody's going to figure that out. I knew a church once that didn't have elders a man's name came up for a gospel meeting, and they didn't schedule him for a meeting. They didn't cancel a meeting, they just didn't schedule him for a meeting. And the word got out, and that they had canceled a meeting on a well-known preacher who stood for the truth, and so that was quite detrimental. And so they began to track down, where'd this come from? Came from one of their members. Okay. Well, why did you tell that? Well, I may have used the wrong word. Yeah, you used the wrong word. You said we canceled a meeting when that meeting wasn't canceled at all. Gave the wrong impression. Does that make sense? That happens from time to time. Incorrect words. So use your words carefully. Learn to communicate carefully. One writer said, I don't know who it was, that said I wouldn't have any problem with communication if it wasn't for words. That's the biggest problem I've got with communication. How true. All right, here's another little thought given to how to word or clarify an announcement or plan. If we've got an announcement to make about a plan that's coming up, here's something we need to get accomplished, here's something we want the church to know about. Some time needs to be spent culling through the words to make sure we're wording that carefully. Most of those kinds of announcements, we sit down in an elders meeting and we cull through those words and we strike a sentence, we put another sentence in, and every elder's laid eyes on that before it goes to be announced, usually. Because we want to carefully present that to the congregation. Make sense? All right, and last of all on that point, just poor listening on the part of the leaders, our elders. Now, one writer made this point that I was reading this week on this matter of communication, the danger of poor communication. To summarize that when there is weak leadership because of weak communication, some diatrophies will come along and seek on that weakness and steal the leadership away by being more influential, because he can communicate well, and therein is a danger. Now let's talk about, in the last few minutes we have, and we may not get back to our scenario, so we may be behind again. Let's talk about rules of communication here. So these are some basic rules of communicating. I think these are important, so we'll try to get through all of these in the next 5 minutes, 6 minutes. If you're going to be a leader and you're going to be a communicator, and you've got to be a communicator to be a leader, these things are essential. Number one, take great pains to speak so that you are understood. Now, can you imagine a commander in the field in an army that he doesn't speak so he's understood, and he gives the wrong message? And they went to firing before he meant for them to fire. They bombed a place he didn't mean for them to bomb, all because he didn't speak clearly. And so here we're dealing with souls, so we got to speak clearly. Now this sounds like the same thing, but this is distinct. I want you to get this point. Work hard to speak so that you're not misunderstood. That goes a step further. We need to speak so that we're understood, but there are some areas particularly where we want to speak so that we're not misunderstood. And that may mean saying, what I mean by that is, and I do not mean. And so you're trying to speak so that you're understood, but I'm not going to be misunderstood here. Does that make sense? That's vitally important as a leader. All right, here's the third thing. Listen to understand. That is, as a leader, when somebody's disagreeing, when somebody's making a suggestion, when somebody's criticizing, when somebody's giving some input, listen to understand. Understanding is not the same thing as agreeing. Would you agree with that? See, I can understand where somebody's coming from. I understand what you're saying. I understand how you got to that point. I don't agree with it. See, I understand how the Baptists can look at Romans 5:1 and conclude faith alone saves. I don't believe that's what it says, but I understand how they got there. I understand their argument. I understand what they're saying. You got that? You see what I'm saying? All right. Try to see things from the other person's point of view. What did God say to Ezekiel? You need to go set where they sat. Is that what God told Ezekiel? Well, what Ezekiel said was, I sat where they sat. He did what God told him. He said, I sat where they sat. In other words, I sat in their shoes. And so try to see things from the other person's point of view. Not from the leader's point of view. You're a leader. You're one of the elders. Look at it from the other person's point of view that you're talking to or that you're leading, etc. That's part of communication. Don't assume more than you know. Larry mentioned this a moment ago. Don't assume more than you know. Proverbs 18:13. Every leader needs to know this principle. He that answers a matter before he hears it is folly and shame. You draw conclusions before you got all the data. That's assuming too much. Drop down to verse 17, same text. The first to defend his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him. There's another side to the story. So don't assume more than you know. Don't assume you know everything about this circumstance. Don't assume part of the story. Don't take 2 and 2, now you've got 6. I know I had to add some, but I've got 2 and 2, and I know there's another 2 there somewhere. Don't add more than is there. That'll get you in trouble as a leader. 1 Corinthians 13:7 says, believe all things, which some translations render that to give the benefit of the doubt. That's what that means. That's a good paraphrase. Probably not a good translation, but a good paraphrase. What does it mean to give the benefit of the doubt? And how does it apply here? Don't assume the worst. Yeah, there may be some information that's missing, and this information could go in this direction. It could go in a worse direction. Give them the benefit of the doubt. That's what I want them to do for me. And you want them to do for you. All right? Make sure you're getting all the information and you're hearing correctly. In other words, ask the right questions. This is not exactly parallel, but I knew a church once that was hiring a preacher, and one of the elders called me and asked me about asking questions about divorce and remarriage. I want to make sure the man taught the truth on divorce and remarriage, and I gave him some questions to ask. Well, they hired the man. Come to find out he taught error. And the elder called back and complained. I said, you didn't ask the right questions. He said, well, we asked him, did he believe Matthew 19:9? I said, that ain't the right question. We asked him if he believed the truth on divorce and remarriage. I said, that's not the right question. You weren't asking the right thing to get what you needed to know. What you should have asked is this question. Did you ask that? No. I said, that's why you got a false teacher in your pulpit. Now, what I'm saying here is sometimes we need to ask a little more information as leaders. Make sure we're getting all the information before making a decision, not just run with what we assume is being said. Does that make sense? Probe a little more, get a little more information so that we have the right information. Yes, sir.
Point C, I was going to say, and really it goes with a lot of this, is a lot of times when we've heard someone say something to us, we could use the speak back or repeat back method. So you could say to them, what I'm hearing you say is this. Am I understanding you correctly? And that you can assume, you can realize then sometimes you may be a better communicator verbally than the person you're sitting across from. A and B applies to them too. They may be speaking that we misunderstand. And by asking them that, or by repeating back to them, you can clear up a lot.
Absolutely, yes, yes. That rehearsing it back to them is very helpful, particularly in controversy. I'm hearing you say, I don't want to accuse you of the wrong thing, but I'm hearing you say X, Y, Z. Well, that's not what I'm saying at all. Now we're getting the information that we need. Don't assume everyone already knows. In the day of social media, we sometimes assume everybody knows because it's all been all over Facebook. Everybody's not on Facebook. Everybody's not on social media. Not everybody gets the one call. Not everybody listens to that. So there may be information we need to get out to the church that most everybody knows, but not everybody knows. Make sense? Fatal assumption that we think everybody already knows. All right. Any questions or comments? Our time is gone. Yes, ma'am.
One thing to consider in communication, not all communication is verbal. There's also body language that comes into play. Don't be saying one thing and showing something else.
That's true. That's true. All right, on our scenarios, we're behind again. I knew we would. That's why I didn't hand one out. So we'll try to get to one at least, if not two, next time. So keep the two you've got.